Hello and thanks for joining us for another Airbrush Asylum step-by-step video. In this two-part video we are going to show you how we airbrushed this particular zombie artwork inspired by The Walking Dead on a Suzuki Boulevard tank. So the burgundy ground color that you see is existing on the tank. So when the customer gave it to us, it had already been painted in the burgundy. I'm pretty sure I would say that would be the factory color. It already had the clear on there, so all we had to do was remove the badges, and then my painter prepped it all up. So we wet sanded the clear with a 1200 wet and dry, and then as you can see, I drew on the artwork using a chalk pencil. So you may have already seen that I've used that particular pencil before in other artworks that I've completed. And I've just mixed up some water-based Trident paint, so just a white with the reducer. And what I'm doing now is just mapping in all my underpainting, so my white underpainting, and just picking out all of the details that I want to include, rather than just doing a flat tone. And I'm kind of shaping the artwork at this stage already. So you want to take your time with this step to include in as much detail as possible. You can see I'm airbrushing the teeth at the moment and bits of the skin, and leaving some of the wounds in the skin, or the rotted skin for that matter, of just leaving those darker and then highlighting around them, so that way I know those bits are the deeper sections of the rotted flesh. You want to make sure that your paint mix is thin enough so that you've got enough control when using a finer airbrush. I'm using the Iwata CMC Micron that has a 0.23mm needle in it, so you could get away with using an airbrush with a 0.3 or 0.35 needle, you know, just to get quicker coverage if you wanted to. But I just the size of the mural, plus I want to add in as much detail as possible in these early stages, so I decided to go with that finer setup. So for that reason, just get your air pressure right, and with your reduction of paint, so that you don't get too much tip drying, even though it's not a big issue if you do at this stage. But you can see I'm able to get some real nice fine detail out of that brush the way it's set up. Just gradually building the detail. Building up my layers. Trying not to oversaturate areas. So just really following my reference. And also utilizing the white at this stage to start to add in some texture. Working in some of that skin section on the head. Up reasonably close, and kind of stippling with the airbrush to get the texture. So back and forth on the trigger to gradually spit out some of the paint. You can see I'm working reasonably tight because I don't want too much overspray, even though I'm going to put a background in there. I'm trying to control it all at this point in time. Building the brightness on that side of the head there. And then again coming back in and adding a bit more of that stippling texture to resemble the hair, just that sort of shaved head. Now working on the torn clothing. And starting to render the hand, all the little fingers. Keep in mind with this camera angle that it may throw a bit of distortion into the proportions of the zombie. So if things look a little bit out, that's why. Obviously, because we're working on a curved surface and I'm trying to film that, it does throw out some of the proportions a little bit due to the camera angle, but yeah, hopefully you can still make out everything clear enough. So just carefully adding in the detail to the fingers. Again, just gradually building my white. Rendering more of the clothing. And just really beginning to shape the artwork. So you can see it's a combination of shadows and sharp lines. Well, in this case using white we could call them highlights and sharp lines, but they're still shaded areas. You notice that little white dot there, that was because when we removed the badges it actually took off a little bit of the ground coat from the factory paint, so this way the mural's hidden it perfectly, and then once all the clear and everything goes back on you'll never know it was even there. Just moving to a different camera angle now to showcase the hand, and just starting to render that as well, starting with all the highlights and then gradually texturing as well, just to give it a more realistic appearance. More detail to the clothing. Again, just adding more white to the fingers, really pull them out and establish the design. So following my highlights, you can see that rotted skin, that wound, really leaving that darker. You can see I'm kind of sketching with the airbrush, so back and forth, back and forth. Especially in these early stages, you can do that. Apologies for the camera movement. Didn't realise I was bumping the tripod at that point. Adding some detail into the wounds there, and then hitting the edge to brighten it. So even though we're going to do numerous colours to layer the skin tones over the top, some of these textures will still shine through, and also any areas that are brighter, that skin tone will sit a bit brighter on those areas. Just rendering the fingertips. You see, really notice my trigger finger there, back and forth every time I'm moving, just so that I don't risk pulling back too far and getting a splotch of paint on there. Just take your time in this step too, don't rush it. Include in as much detail as possible. And just paint what you see as well, so when you're working off a reference, try to follow it as exactly as possible. You can see now the fingertips are starting to become a bit more three-dimensional. Another fingernail there. Moving back over some of the areas that I'd already completed, just cross-checking my reference, brightening up certain areas. Again, just building my layers. Try not to saturate them too quickly. Remember, we don't want them to become flat either by just doing them all solid white. So that's why I like to use this technique where you work off a basic outline and then just render freehand off that. Just jump to a different camera angle now, and we're going to start adding in the background. So this zombie appears to be crawling across the ground, and we're just adding in some of the ground level and the damaged walls around where he's crawling from, just to create that sense of depth. You can see the dark, funny shape that's underneath his chest there is the actual pool of blood. Then there's another one just above where his shoulder is, close to his head there, and that's the tail end of the blood as he's pulling his torso along the ground. So just carefully rendering in the background, using white to establish everything, and then we'll just come back in and render it all and pop it all out. But the idea is I want it to blend back into that burgundy color. Bit of a tack rag there. Keep it nice and clean, you know, get all the overspray off there. Obviously prior to beginning this project, once the tank was wet sanded, we did prep it all using a wax and grease remover first, so applying that, then wiping it off, and then using a water-based degreaser by House of Kolor afterwards, just to remove any last bits of residue. And then just careful when we're working on it, trying not to get fingerprints or anything on there. So you can see the background's all done, and hence why I'm wearing a glove, because I'm getting really close now to the artwork. So the hand that you use to lean on the project, make sure you've got a glove on so that you don't transfer any of your natural oils into the paintwork, which could be a problem when we go to clear it, or when our painter goes to clear it. Probably notice we've changed color now, so we've finished with our white and we've switched now to the Createx dermatitis tan color. So this is in their bloodline range. And all I'm doing with this tone is dusting over all of the skin tone areas. So it has been mixed with a bit of reducer, but not overly thin, just thin enough to run smoothly without getting tip drying, but still allowing enough coverage. Once we get this coated over all those white areas, we'll obviously come in with a darker flesh tone and start really shaping it. You can see I'm even dusting over where some of the wounds are, just to give a flesh tone base in those areas as well. Also using this color just a little bit in the background to give it more of a dirty appearance. And now we're change camera angle, and we've got a flesh tone which we've mixed up, which will now provide all the darker shading. So we're really going to now start to pop out the design and really deepen the shadows. This was already a pre-mixed illustration color that we had, so I can't 100% remember the exact mix, but effectively, as long as this particular color is darker than the previous dermatitis tan that we used, then it'll be fine. And you can actually, if you're not as confident with airbrushing and you're still sort of in the earlier stages, even though this artwork would be quite challenging if you're not as advanced with the airbrush, but if you are going to give it a go or something similar, then you can also sort of make it lighter than what you see here. That'll just allow you a bit more control, and then you just gradually go a bit darker and follow the other steps in this video. But you can see it's kind of like a reddish skin tone, so So effectively what I'm doing now is using that tone, I'm just deepening all the darker areas, so all the shaded areas. I start in the absolute darkest spots. That way I can gauge how dark the other areas are meant to be. So basically, like you can see, starting around the eye there, it's reasonably dark. I'll do that with pretty much almost 100% coverage of the color, and then I can work off that according to the other shadows, which you can work out by looking at your reference, but you're really shaping the design using this particular tone. So it's crucial now that you start to really paint in all the areas accurately, because this tone will then be your foundation for all the previous, or for all the other tones that we're going to add to it, so gradually going darker. So you need to make sure that this one's accurate, because you don't want to keep repeating your mistakes all the way through. If you got the ground coat perfect, well then you can pretty much just follow that. But always, every step that I take, that particular color I don't sort of look at anymore. I kind of just use that as a rough guide, but I always refer back to my reference as the exact placement for the tones and the detailing and also the texturing and all that sort of stuff that makes up the artwork. So keep that in mind and try not to rush it either. You want to really take your time, especially at this stage. And again, the more detail that you can put in now, the better. Even if you hide 70 to 80% of it, it doesn't really matter. It's still going to help to build that artwork that's a bit more impressive than just a flat rendered piece. So just taking my time, working in all the details around the eyes. Trying to stay really clean with this color, so keep it nice and sharp, and then blending out from your darker areas. Cutting in around the nose area there. You can see I'm nice and sharp and then blending out from my initial sharp shadow. Still adding texture as I go. Little grooves and damages to the skin where it's been torn up. Some of the drool. Now establishing the teeth. So carefully cutting in around them with this colour. Nice and close with my airbrush so that I don't get a lot of overspray, and just careful not to pull too far back on that trigger. So you also want to make sure that your paint is mixed to your liking, so there's no real 100% perfect mix. It really depends on a lot of factors, your air pressure with your what's set on your regulator. So obviously if it's a higher pressure, sometimes you might want to run a thicker paint. If it's thinner paint, I usually reduce the pressure right down, so generally 15 to 20 psi. I've also got the adjustment on the front of my Iwata airbrush there, that MAC valve, which allows me to drop the pressure internally in the gun, so that just the pressure coming out can be reduced. So that just allows for a nice, smooth, fine detail that it does surpass even dropping the pressure on your compressor, so it just allows a bit more control. Be careful not to go too dark at this stage. Again, follow your reference, but start in all the dark areas first and then render out from there. So you can see I'm shading areas as well over the skin with this tone. So I'm pretty much treating the painting as if I'm only using this particular tone to create all the different tonal variations. Adding more texture. Blending out from some of my darker areas. Bit of stippling there as well with the airbrush. So you can see my trigger fingers going back and forth, back and forth. So starting to really bring together all my shading there. Working off my initial areas and then blending back out. Establishing any of those grooves in the head there. Bit of texture in underneath that wound. Picking off a little bit of tip drying, so that's pretty common. So I'm working reasonably close for most of this. And then just, as you can see there, when I'm dusting in on the skin areas and I wanted a bit of a softer shadow, I'm coming back further from the surface and just opening up a little bit more with the airbrush, like pulling that trigger back a bit further to release more paint. However, when I'm up close, you can notice my trigger fingers just ever so slightly going back and forth, back and forth. The reason for that is I'd rather just build it slowly rather than just trying to smash on the paint and do it all in one hit. That way I'll get more control and I can just build my detail gradually rather than risking, pulling back too far and, getting a blob of paint on the work. Adding more texture. You could also use other techniques if you wanted to do this texturing a bit quicker. I just decided to do majority of it freehand. Later on I do use a bit of a texture template as well for certain effects, but as you can see here, most of it is freehand. But you can also use an eraser pencil, especially if you're using the Createx illustration colors. Other paints will erase as well, but you just got to be a bit quicker with removing them because they've got faster dry times. But there's little stippling templates and all sorts of things you can use, but I don't mind doing it freehand. It just takes a little bit longer. You can see all the hair stippling there's been done now. Now I've just moved further away from the surface and I'm just lightly dusting over to create some more shape on that forehead. So that's usually what I do, is I'll establish all of my texture early on and then I can dust back over it, and look, it does take the edge off and eliminate a little bit of that texture, but with the paints being transparent, they're allowing for that to show through as you build more and more layers. So it just provides a more realistic look. So back on the teeth now, so you can see how much I do jump around on an artwork. I get kind of a little bit bored if I'm just sitting in one spot for a long period of time, so I like to move around a bit, and then that way it also gets my eye looking back at the reference, and you sort of tend to freshly look at that area that you're painting again. Whereas if you just stare at that for a long extended period, you tend to miss, well, I do anyway, I start to miss certain details. So by moving around, you get that fresh look all the time, which I find is handy. So everyone's going to be different, so whatever works for you. Just carefully rendering around those teeth so I don't get too much overspray. Even though this is an early layer, I want to get it fairly accurate. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of using this tone as if it's the only tone that I'll be using. So that way it forces you to control it a little bit more and create those tonal values rather than just doing a flat tone, because you want to deepen your shadows. You want to build your artwork with every tone that you do. So, and if you do struggle using this tone, like if it's too dark for you from the previous one, to this one, if that's too greater a step, then by all means just add a few more steps to the process. So make a lighter flesh tone first, and then gradually go darker with your flesh tones, and render the same way I'm doing now. So again, constantly looking at my reference. Another little tip with the reference is that, which I'm sure most of you do, instead of just using, say, a printout, load it up on your iPad, your laptop, or any sort of device that you can zoom in on, and then that way you can really focus on a certain area, because by shutting off all the other areas of the painting, especially when you're doing portraits, even though this isn't 100% a portrait, but some of the aspects of the design do lend themselves to portrait painting. So by blocking off the other areas, that can help you just focus on that one spot. So having the ability to zoom in makes a fair bit of difference, because you really just want to focus your eye on painting what you see, not worrying too much about the surroundings. And I've seen it with students before where they get distracted, because even when they're painting one eye, they're busy looking at the other eye, the nose section, the bit above the eye, the brow. Even though all those areas will make up the final component, if you treat each area separately, I've gotten students to actually cut a section of paper and just cut out where you're working, so a little square, and then block off the rest of it, and then that helps your eye just focus on that one spot rather than getting distracted. So keep that in mind. So starting to work on the hand there, rendering the fingers very, very carefully. Apologies for this looking a little bit out of whack from the camera angle, but if you can imagine, that's right on the curve of the tank, so it proportionally it might be a little bit difficult to follow, but again, you know, you'll be painting off a reference, so you can use that. You notice there I've grabbed one of my freehand shields. It's actually one of the Tru Fire Series 2 sets by Mike LaValle. And look, these templates have been so helpful, you know, like either Series 1 or 2, it doesn't really matter, but these sort of curves are just, you know, I'm constantly using them. They're just quick and easy, and it's amazing how you'll grab one of them and there always seems to be a curve that you need in that particular painting. It's like it just fits to, you know, it's like almost one size fits all. So if you haven't got yourself a set, by all means, think about getting one. They're not the cheapest, but I think you get, when you cut them up, I think you get about 18 different sizes in the sets. They're also available in like a mini set, but you can visit our online store if you're in Australia, airbrushasilum.com.au, or alternatively you can jump on our Amazon influencer page and you can purchase them on there if you are overseas. So you can see I'm just working in the fingernails there. And for quick links to any of those sites, they'll be in the description of the video. So that hand's starting to come to life a bit now. Remember, it is a zombie hand, so it can appear to be a little bit mangled. As you can see, I'm not just flat toning areas, I'm still adding in texture and damage to the skin. Remember, it is a zombie, so the skin's not going to be perfect like a normal portrait would be or a normal human painting. So we want to start to really build that texture as we go along in each step. Just shading off those fingers as well. Just coming back to some of the previous areas, just revisiting them. As I mentioned earlier, I do work back over sections. Just taking my time, adding a few little finer details in, darkening off even more. Because these colours are fairly transparent, you got a lot of variation that we can put in there by just like continually saturating. Obviously it's going to get to a point where they're completely covered, but you can see I'm still able to darken off certain areas even further. You know, with this step you really want it to start to almost look very, very close to the reference. If it's looking already like the reference, you're on the right track, because then you've got your foundations laid, and then all you have to do is add in, you know, your little bits of color and imperfections to the skin, and then just deepen all those shadows and add your highlights and all that sort of stuff, so which we'll get into. Just shading out some of those areas on the neckline there. Up close for any real sharp shadows. Darkening off some of those grooves in the forehead. Now working on the scar on the head there. Just blending that out. Different camera angle now, we're onto the hand. So this will be the one that's meant to look like it's appearing like it's reaching out, so like the zombies crawling out of the tank. So we're starting off again with one of our fire templates there, and we're just going to define some of these fingernails. Again, wherever your reference deems sharp edges, don't be afraid then to use a template. It's going to help with giving you a more photorealistic appearance. Trying to find the right edge there. You can see how carefully I'm pulling back on the trigger not to slip, especially because I'm only using one hand at the moment, and constantly moving away, checking it, and then repositioning my template. You can see even just a small spray makes a big difference, so it's a good idea to just be careful at this stage. Even just using the template there to create some sharp drop shadows to really make those fingers pop. It'll all make more sense once I add that particular tone to the whole hand. Just getting some of the grooves in there. Working out which part of the fingers will be in the foreground. So again, you know, really looking at my reference for each step. You can see how even just the slightest amount of overspray is really pulling those sections out and lifting those fingers. And now I'm going in with a bit of freehand. Bit more tip drawing. Again, following through with my shadows, detailing, adding the texture, and also correcting. You can see how I did that little sharp shadow joining up to the other finger there, from the top finger to the one on the left as we're looking at it now, and you can see I've cut in a bit further so that you know, that's more of an accurate shape than what was actually drawn out. So once I go to positive mask the artwork to pop out the background and to pop out the actual completed zombie, I'll make sure that I note that and then work my my masking and all that stuff up to that edge. Bit more texture, bit of freehand. Again, because this is the focal point of the artwork, you don't want to rush it. Not that you should be rushing any part of the artwork, really, just take your time. Working in the wound there. The other wound. Again, a bit of stippling texture. Starting to really create some shape now. Pulling on more and more detail out of that hand. as you can see, majority of it is still done freehand. I just established all the real sharp shadows first. Hard to see the rendering of that thumb, but again it's a little bit out of perspective due to the tank rolling under and the camera angle there, but you get the idea. More texturing and more skin damage there to the zombie fingers, making the flesh look a bit more rotten. Just rendering the final finger, same sort of procedure, just really shaping each individual finger and adding all of the texturing and the detailing as I go. Pretty much finished up there with that hand now for this particular tone anyway. And I'm just going to start on this wound where the tear is in the clothing. Apologies for the airbrush being out of sight, but we'll change camera angle in a minute. I think you pretty much get the gist with this tone. So now that we completed that particular skin tone, we've moved on to a different mix just to dirty up the clothing. This mix is made up of grey, red, violet and magenta. So all illustration, Createx illustration colours for this one. And that's giving us that that sort of dirty-ish colour there. And we're just flat toning all those areas, so I'm not worried too much. Don't have to be super accurate, it can be a little bit patchy as well. I just wanted that that particular tone as a base colour, and then I can render over the top of it. Just going to take that stark whiteness away. Give it just a bit more of a dirty look, which is what we're going for. So just change the camera angle now, and we're zooming back in on the face, and we now have white in our airbrush. So before we go to the final tone, you may have seen me do this before. I usually use white. The reason being is that I can add the white into my painting at this stage. I can really create more of a realistic look. I can see where the painting's going. I can get in all those wet spots, especially with this particular artwork where there's a lot of those wet spots on the skin and in the wound areas, and I can just breathe life into it. I mean, you can see there just by putting that specular highlight in the eye and then rendering around the eye there, that it's just lifted that and made it look so much more real than the other side, which it just remains flat. So it's going to give me that added dimension. I can establish all my highlights so that I know where they are and where they're going to go. But more importantly, the reason I do it before I go to the darkest tone is because white will always give you a little bit of overspray, so you want to try and eliminate that. And also, it also eliminates the fact that if you paint with the white over a darker shade, you'll get that blue shift, which wouldn't be too much of an issue with this particular painting, because you could get away with that cold sort of tone, but it will shift the white to a bluey, colder sort of feel. That can be rectified as well, but that's a whole nother video. But so that's why I do it, and because of the overspray as well, so you just get a nice clean crisp edge once you come back in with your darker tone and you've already established all your white highlights. Obviously, if things aren't bright enough and the reference deems them to be brighter, or if it's an artwork you're doing completely freehand and you want them to be brighter, by all means you can come back in with your white, but you just got to make sure that you control it enough so that you try to eliminate it sitting on top of any of those darker areas. So remember to get your white mix mixed up really nicely so that it flows with whatever airbrush and whatever size needle you're using. So if you have to run it a bit thinner, by all means do. That means you'll have to coat it more often to get coverage, but it's certainly better than getting tip drying. Also just adjust your pressure if you need to control all of that, but I've allowed so that it is relatively thin, however I'm still getting decent coverage. So the mix is set up for my CMC plus Micron, so whatever airbrush you're using, the airbrush I'm using at the moment has a 0.23mm needle in it, so reasonably fine. Not the finest that I have, the finest one I use is a 0.18, but this is still reasonably fine. So you just want to make sure that it's nice and mixed correctly so that it avoids a lot of tip drying and a lot of hassle for you. I also recommend straining the paint, and if you are doing an artwork like this, which is relatively small, try to stay away from using really old paint. I mean, if you have to use it, then like I mentioned, get yourself a paper strainer and strain it. But I try to, any sort of commission work that I'm doing, I always run all my paints through a strainer. It doesn't take a lot of time, they're inexpensive, and it just saves you a lot of hassle. You get less tip drying, cleaner paint, and just less chance of anything going wrong, so keep that in mind. So you can see here with that portion of the white done, it's definitely lifting the artwork. So you can see I'm using the white to re-stipple in that hair, so the real shaved head of the zombie. Again, back and forth on that trigger. You can see by cleaning out the tip drying how much better it flows. You'll notice that you'll get more tip drying, especially with white. And when you are doing these careful stippling techniques, you got a lot more air passing through, so it's going to create more tip drying for you. So just bear in mind, you'll notice that my airbrush travels off the screen quite a bit and out of shot, so that's generally what I'm doing when that's happening. I'm sure if anyone's seen any of my raw videos, so you'll definitely notice that there's been issues with airbrushes, there's been tip drying problems, so I tend to keep all that in there so that you can see what's going on. These particular step-by-steps, they're fully edited and a bit more polished, so I don't tend to put all those in. I just try and, because they're long enough as they are, so I don't want to drag it on too long. But yeah, if you want to see some of the raw ones, by all means check them out, because that'll show you some of the mistakes that are made. And look, it's normal. That's why I don't think they should be edited out, and I think a lot of people tend to like the raw videos for that reason, because they see, even after so many years of airbrushing, I'm still getting, issues with the airbrush, issues with the paint, and it's going to happen to anyone. Just with more experience means that you'll learn how to fix problems a lot quicker. And if you do make a mistake, you're not too stressed about it. So just brightening up on any of the wounds where you've got that real wet, the wet spots of the wound there. Hitting some of the white highlights in the teeth now. Adding some cracks in there too, and a bit of unevenness. We don't want him to look like he's just been to the dentist with perfect shiny whites. He is a zombie, so they can be a bit damaged and stained. Obviously we're going to come in with more shading later on, but at this stage we just want to really lift them out and add some of those white highlights just to really make them pop. Bit of the drool as well. So just carefully adding in highlights wherever it need be without overdoing it. it's very easy to get carried away. So just, if you're unsure, keep referring back to that reference. The reference essentially is your instruction manual. So just follow it and you should be right. Bit more texturing. Hope you're enjoying this video. So if this is the first time to our channel, we'd love to have you as part of our community. So by all means, feel free to hit subscribe, tap on that bell icon, and that will notify you every time we put out new content. Generally, we try to do 1 to 2 videos per week. So just adding in more and more texture, hitting and brightening more of those highlights. Just really shaping the artwork with this tone. So I'm using white now to render sections of the clothing. So I'm just adding texture, highlighting some of the folds in the actual material, and just overall detailing it out using the white, just so that we get a bit more of a 3D effect with the clothing at this stage. So again, just like I said before, follow your reference. If you're making it up and you don't have a reference that's exact, you can always get pictures of different types of material that you could, that you could replicate. So there's many ways to do it, but we're just building that white over that existing dirty color that we did earlier, the one with the grey and the magenta mix and that red violet. So you can see how much different the white looks on top of that now. So because we did a dirtier tone underneath, that white's really popping. So that's another reason why I like to do that. Just allows me to further shape all the clothing at an early stage when I'm just using white, and then I can come in with my shading afterwards. Again, working back in the skin area there on the wounds, and just using that white to create more texture in the skin. Again, I'm moving around quite a lot in my artwork. You know, now I'm back onto the clothing, so it's just the way I paint. You'll find you'll develop your own style and method of how you create your artwork. So this isn't a you know, you have to do it this way type of thing. I'm just showing you how I've done it. You know, if you pick up some tips, great. But you know, more often than not, you'll probably pick up a few things and then just add them into the way you would normally paint your pictures, which is exactly what I want you to be doing. You know, I want you to create, everyone has their own style, and I think that's important. So adding white highlights to the fingers and the hand there. Again, same process as rendering the face. You've just got to allow for, you know, obviously different areas and whether or not it's going to have as many wounds on there. There is a slight wound on that hand, but we still don't want the skin on the hand to be super smooth and perfect, so just keep that in mind. It's still got to look like a zombie's hand. Probably just dealing with a bit of tip drying there, so apologies for that, but it's going to happen. Re-rendering a bit of the clothing, then coming back to the hand. Change the camera angle. Now we're focusing on the hand that'll be appearing to be in the foreground. So just going to start rendering that. Obviously there's a lot more detail in this one. This is a lot larger because it's in the, as I mentioned, the foreground of the artwork, so it's meant to look like the zombie is reaching out and crawling out of the tank. So doing a bit of the stippling and texturing there. Again, building up the tone. So mostly rendering freehand at this stage, which gives a bit of a nice variation from the harsher edges that we created earlier with those freehand templates. So that's just helping to give you that more realistic effect. Sometimes having that the mixture of the sharp and the softer areas definitely works. Again, I do know that I'm going to come back in with a darker tone, so I'm going to clean up a lot of these areas again. But at this stage I just want to keep building my highlights, building my texture, and really shaping the fingers and the hand as an overall piece of artwork. So I'm treating it as if it's the its own little entity. So up close to get my nice sharp highlights. And then carefully dusting from a distance to just build my blends. Just taking my time. Again, just building my white. You can see I'm sticking to the lighter areas. I'm trying not to get my white over the darker shadowed areas. And having it a bit thinner there, you can notice that it does need a few more coats. Unless I'm up extremely close, then I get a reasonably sharp bright white highlight. you can really begin to notice how much the white has made the overall design really pop, and texturing as well has helped for all the, you know, the skin damage on the hand there. And again, it's just pretty much using that stippling technique. As you noticed, I've done most of it freehand, so a bit brighter on some of the fingernails. So you can see it's shaped up quite nicely now. Just a bit more uneven tone. But you can see how much the white has changed it. Now that I've done most of it freehand, I've decided to grab my Texture Effects 1 Series Mini template, and I'm just going to add a bit of texture using white. So it might be a little bit difficult to see, but because we're going back over what I've already painted, what will happen is that the Texture Effects template's going to allow for the opacity is going to build up on that area that I'm spraying, and you're going to get a bit of that texture sitting on top of the already whitened areas. So just moving that template around. Again, with any of these templates, if you hold them flat on the surface, you're going to get a nice defined texture, whereas if you lift them off, you know, just raise them a little bit and hover them over the surface and then spray through, you're going to get a softer texture. These Texture Effects templates, they're great. I've got all the mini series and the large ones, and I use them a lot. Just really handy, especially for this sort of an artwork. Just keep moving that texture template around and gradually building our texture. So you can see how much that's changed as well, because now we've got the freehand element which we just completed, and then over the top of that we've been using our texture template. So it just gives you that harsh edge on top of the softer. Having that complete mix just makes it more realistic. So grabbing that texture template again. I like the way it looked on the hand, so now I'm going to use that in certain areas on the zombie's head as well. Just carefully using it in spots but not going overboard. Again, you can get easily carried away with these templates. Sometimes less is more. But for those real bright textured highlights, it's definitely a handy tool, especially with the addition of a bit of freehand airbrushing previously. It's going to tie it all nicely together. So a few final white highlights here. We've done all the other white highlights and texture using our texture template. The particular white that we're using, I mean, you can use any white, but in this particular case I use the Old Bone White, which is from the Createx Bloodline series. So it's just a little bit of an off-white, which works well for this particular zombie artwork. But now that we've finished up with our white there, we are going to switch to a thinned out and transparent scarlet. So using the scarlet from the Createx illustration colors, and we're going to begin to render the blood areas with this particular tone. So as I mentioned, I did mix it up with transparent base and reducer. The scarlet is pretty strong as straight out of the bottle, so by adding the transparent base and reducer, we're creating a sort of tone that's a lot more obviously transparent, but also we can control it a little bit more, so we're not going to get instant sort of coverage, so we don't want it too stark too quick. Okay, so it's just going to help to bloody up our wounds on this particular artwork. So virtually now I'm just following my reference, and I'm using that scarlet color on all the wound areas of the painting and just coating back over them if I want them to go a bit deeper. So it's kind of like making similar to an automotive candy color. If you add the transparent base and the reducer, it allows you to do numerous coats. It's not going to go like a traditional candy would, like if you kept coating it'll go almost black, but it's still got that vibrancy and the transparency of a candy. So you're not going to lose all your hard-earned detail and texturing that you've done previously. And that's another reason why we've extended it with that transparent base. You can see I'm coating over it quite a bit and just gradually building it up without oversaturating. Gives me a bit more control. Adding the red in that scar on the head there and that big wound. Doing it around the eyes there as well. Just making them look a bit bloodshot. Again, just be careful with this particular tone, you don't want to overdo it. Only add it into the areas where it needs to be. So pretty much wrapping it up now with that, adding all the blood in, using that scarlet color, so you can see how much that's changed the artwork at this stage. So it's coming along nicely. So I hope you enjoyed the first part of this video. There is a part 2, so make sure you tune in and check that out to see the completed artwork. Until next time, feel free to check out any of our other videos, and thanks again for watching. We do really appreciate it. In the meantime, if you haven't already, feel free to hit subscribe. We have plenty of step-by-step tutorials, quick tips, airbrush insights, showcase, live streams, and much more. You can also visit our website at airbrushaasylum.com.au. Thanks for watching.